One. Oh, we are good to rock and roll. So thank you guys for rocking up here this evening. Unlike the past couple months that we've done here, as you guys know, this one is going to be a lot more story time. We're not doing any real technical stuff and all that sort of stuff, but we're just going to kind of give you a bit of a perspective about the different upper cervical techniques, their evolution, their history, all that sort of stuff, how they are similar, how they are ever so slightly different. And reason for this was some many years ago now when I was doing a little bit of teaching work, and I had asked, or excuse me, one of the students had asked me what technique did I use, and at the time I was using Atlas orthogonal, and he asked, well, what is that? And I said, oh, it's an upper cervical technique. And he paused for a second. He's like, okay, upper cervical. Oh, is that thing that BJ did? And I was kind of taken aback like that. It's like, you know nothing about your history on this. You think there's a bit of a thing. So that was a bit of an eye opener for me some long time ago. And it's because upper cervical is actually, in reality, it's not a technique at all. It is a different way of looking and understanding the relationship between the spine, emphasis on the upper neck, and the function of the nerve system. And so we're going to take a little bit of that story here tonight. And it was also interesting when I was thinking about this, because again, and of course, why do I do what I do? Because I love it, but also I, very much of the opinion that this is arguably the most powerful thing that we have in chiropractic. And as you'll see that upper cervical, all of the techniques, they have a certain stigma associated with them. They're perceived as being somewhat old-fashioned, or oh, that's the way that the field used to do it, or that it's very dogmatic and things like that. And it went very much out of favor between the 1960s and has had a bit of a renaissance in the last 15 to 20 years, but still has not completely taken off. Now, nevertheless, I can't help but feel very strongly about this, that in some ways the evolution of upper cervical techniques basically took a nap for 70 years. And yet, in many regards, we are still light years ahead of where the rest of the profession is in terms of some of the opinions, philosophy, squabbling, science, application, all that sort of stuff. So we're just going to be, giving you a little bit of the stories, trying to put some of the bits and pieces together here. As you know, we are doing the recording and all that sort of stuff. If you guys have any comments, questions, anything like that, A, feel free to shout them out at any time. B, feel free to put them in the chat box. And C, if you don't want to be formally identified, then just send it to me privately through the chat box. And then when I answer that question, I will not name you by name, so that everything is anonymous in that regard. So when we're looking at the evolution, and not just upper cervical as an approach, but as chiropractic as a whole, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning, not with this guy, but arguably with his father, D.D. Palmer, who was the founder of chiropractic, but then B.J. Palmer, within really just a few short years, really taking the helm, taking control of the helm, and being the developer of chiropractic as it went through so many of its initial hurdles, challenges, and all of this sort of stuff. Because one of the things that's very important to understand about the nature of medical politics back in the early part of the 1900s is that there were two factions essentially fighting for control. You had the medical profession that, as far as they were concerned, if it had anything to do with the human body, it was theirs. And the alternate of that was what were considered the naturopaths. And these are not the naturopaths that exist today. A naturopath back then was basically somebody who didn't go with the drugs and surgery. They believed in the natural medicines, the herbs, the stretching, the physiotherapy, the massage, the homeopathy, the spiritual healing, all of that sort of stuff. They said, if it is not drugs and surgery, it belongs to us. Physiotherapy, osteopathy, chiropractic were no exceptions to that rule. And yet, as the profession was very new and emergent, with both D.D. Palmer, B.J. Palmer, and many others saying, no, this is a separate and distinct profession, What they had to do, amongst other things, is not just proclaim that through marketing efforts, but in order to survive, they had to be able to clarify and distinguish that they actually had a separate philosophy, science, and art that was separate from medicine, separate from naturopathy, separate from osteopathy, in order for it to function, in order for it to actually be recognized. So the prevailing, quote unquote, wisdom or thought of the day, very much medicine, really things haven't changed, is that medicine and problems, they're coming to get you from outside in. They're germs and they are infections and they're your genes. And so what we need to do is we need to give you drugs. We need to have surgery. We need to treat the effects and all of this sort of stuff. Well, this is not really a chiropractic principle at all. This is a natural principle about life and the way that the human body and, all of that sort of stuff works. It's that health does not come from outside in, it comes from inside out. That when you have a disruption in health, it's not because something from the outside gotcha, it's because something on the inside is not working the way that it is supposed to. And so then what we are doing about it is we're not doing a stretch, we're not doing a manipulation, we're doing a very specific kind of correction for something that we are calling and identifying a subluxation. That is the thing of the spine that is impacting and reducing the normal functional flow of things in terms of body function and in terms of, overall health. That is the perspective that chiropractic has to say, this is what we stand for, this is what we believe. Now, in this, it all actually hangs on this word right here, subluxation, because really without that as being the central core of it all, the whole rest of it falls apart because, as I had just said, the naturopath said that we do believe in inside out approaches. And you had the osteopaths and the physiotherapists, and the massage therapists, all that sort of stuff saying, hey, we're doing all of this stuff with the spine anyway. Now, the question is why are you doing it and how do you substantiate it? It all had to do with your ability to demonstrate, not from an airy-fairy viewpoint that, okay, we have this nebulous idea, but we have this construct called a subluxation. How then can we actually empirically demonstrate it exists? So there was the development of this. This is not the first definition of subluxation. This is not the best. This maybe even isn't the most contemporary. And in fact, this was not any of those different kinds of things. It nevertheless is probably one of the better definitions in the sense that it gives a breakdown of key characteristics that we need to be able to quantify, that we need to be able to measure, and against which all other definitions at the very least need to take these things account. I repeat, it's not the best, it's not the most complete, it may not even be the most, accurate, but it's nevertheless the one that's got the best little details in there. So what do we got? We've got a misalignment, and a misalignment of what? Articular surfaces between two vertebrae. D.D. Palmer's original definition of subluxation, or even when he was calling it a luxation, was that of the displacement of articular surfaces, the joint space between two bones, not the bone itself. The result of the misalignment is that it's producing occlusion, some kind of a blockage or a stretching, or where normally you're going to have this kind of a space, you don't really have that. There's not as much functional space, as much room. The consequence of that, it is either impinging, producing pressure, stretching. It's doing something to the nervous system, simply put. And the consequence of that is that it is interfering with the normal flow of what was called the mental impulse. If I was going to make an analogy right here, let's say that you turn into a radio station 96.9, okay? 96.9 refers to the frequency that you're able to tune into. But the music that is transmitted over that frequency, that then is, okay, the reason that we're tuning in. So we're making a clarification here that there's a difference between a nerve impulse, which is like the frequency, and the mental impulse, which contemporary authors would say this would be the equivalent of saying function, nerve function. There's a reason why a message is being sent through the neurophysiology in a certain way. And so if we were to look at this and really break it down into two pieces, we're going to be saying that first, there is a biomechanical element, there is a physical something. Second to that, there is a neurological component. Something is interfering with the normal function of the nerves. There is also, and this is a completely different discussion, we'll be doing this later in the year, there was an additional part to this definition that was added and recognized starting in the 1930s, and it is that the body is not able to fix these kind of problems in and of itself. Because you see, if it was just a simple matter of do this meditation, take this supplement, do this stretch, do this kind of an exercise, go to the gym, whatever, just do that. There's no reason for chiropractic to exist. So point is that there's something different about this entity. And that then, in terms of us taking the inside out approach and using a specific correction or something we're calling an adjustment for this thing, these are the principles on which chiropractic was ultimately founded. And so that's all well and good, but guess what you have to do then? You have to be able to back it up with actual data. So that is what this guy then sought out to do. It began with a good chunk of D.D. Palmer's work that was done in conjunction with a lot of the other early chiropractors, the development of something that was called the Merrick system. And what the Merrick system was, is the recognition, as you would be learning in basic neurology, is that you got this wire that comes out of this part of the spine and it goes to this particular tissue somewhere in the body. And so if a person is experiencing symptoms in a certain part of the body, aha, it's because that must be where the segment is actually misaligned. And so what a great number of the many chiropractors back in the early days were doing is they would practice Merrick system based on patient symptomatology. And here was the kicker, is if people experience multiple symptoms at different levels of the body, guess what they would adjust? However many of them, those so happen to be. There are 24 movable segments. Well, arguably, why don't we just do all of them? It was a lot of hit and miss. It was looking for something specific, but it wasn't able to pin it down per se. So how interesting, as useful and valuable as these kind of charts still are, how many chiropractors still in 2022 practice using this chart and basing their decision on symptomatology in a local part of the body? It's one of the oldest methods of chiropractic. So you had all of these 24 movable segments, including sacroiliacs and lower extremities and all of this sort of stuff. It's like, okay, we need to find ways of narrowing it down. And so this was the development then of the early palpation methods, looking for what were called taut and tender fibers. The notion, the idea that if you had inflammation or irritation of a nerve, that you would actually be able to palpate where the areas, there would be local areas of swelling, there would be local areas of tightened muscle, and that you could detect using your fingers, natural approaches, where exactly in the spine it would be where problems were going on. So what were they able to do by doing this? They were able to narrow the 24 down to say 12. Okay, we're starting to go in the right direction. A few years later comes the introduction of the spinograph, that is X-ray, into the profession, which is one of the major schisms that we have in our checkered history. We have half the profession saying that X-ray, this isn't natural. We don't want this. We're going to keep practicing this way. And then you got the other half of the profession saying, hey, we can see inside of the spine now. This is fantastic. We're going to do this. So we have a disagreement in terms of how we proceed. That disagreement persists to this day, lucky us. Nevertheless, this gave us additional insight in terms of, okay, not just going off of our fingers, because our fingers, as we had shown you guys last month in lecture 2 on asymmetry, that what you see and what you feel on the outside is not necessarily what's actually going on the inside. And so it gave us additional clarity as chiropractors in terms of what was going on so that we could be more specific. Hey, this spinous process isn't actually turned like that. The thing is actually malformed. So what I am feeling, no, that's actually not the problem at all. We need to go looking for somewhere else. And so over the span of the 1910s and then into the early 1920s, this is how a good chunk of the chiropractic profession is proceeding using these bits of technology. Then introduce what, in my opinion, is the single greatest fracture that we have ever had in the chiropractic profession, was the introduction of the neurocoulometer in 1924. What was a neurocoulometer? Neurocoulometer was a heat measuring instrument that was used to scan along the back of the spine, and areas where you saw specific deviations were used to determine where there were localized areas of inflammation, and was used as evidence in support of that subluxation hypothesis. And so you might be thinking, well, that actually sounds great, having an instrument that can actually show people where subluxation is. This is fantastic. Well, here was the problem. You couldn't buy one. You could only lease one from the Palmer School. And it would have been the equivalent in modern day value as if you wanted to buy a house. So the thing was darn expensive. Oh yeah, and BJ goes out and says to the profession, if you're not using one of these, you're not practicing chiropractic anymore. You know, love them, hate them, and all that sort of stuff. It's like, you know, you want to create a fracture. It's like, that's how you do it. You just tell people that what they're doing is wrong. I'm disowning you and you suck. Arguably, it was the introduction of the NCM that basically took where he was the leader of the profession to where suddenly through the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, then you had people challenging him, and where there was much more animosity towards him, both professionally and also personally. And like a great many, you know, advances in technology out there, version 1 of everything sucks. The original NCM had all kinds of issues associated with it. They were able to reconcile them over time, but, you know, once bitten, twice shy was kind of the situation. Nevertheless, BJ was adamant that this, was going to be the future of chiropractic. And so he persisted using the neurocoulometer for his research purposes. And this led him to the recognition of what were called majors and minors. So remember, we talked about the early Merrick system, that you could have lots of different symptoms and all this sort of stuff. However, the recognition came after a period of time. You know, there are some things that are more important than others. In other words, there is a hierarchy in terms of subluxations, severity, deleterious effects on the body. And so let's try to see if we can figure out and focus on where the major ones are and then where the minor ones are. And so what this allowed us to do was this allowed us to narrow down our search from 12 to 7 down to about 3 different levels where you could have a potential subluxation in a body at any time. Nevertheless, there was an idea that had persisted through chiropractic since the beginning. It's this idea of what's called the HIO principle, stands for hole in one. So like a golf shot, perfect shot, one tee off in the hole, not just eagle, double eagle, all that sort of stuff. The idea is greatest amount of reward for least amount of work. If we can find through the course of our investigations or research or instrumentation or X-ray analysis, if we can find where that one primary major subluxation is, then the innate intelligence of the body should be able to correct and resolve all of the other stuff without us ever having to do it. Wouldn't it be great if we could find where the HIO spot in the spine was? And it was originally a full spine concept. It was originally a full spine concept. The problem was we didn't know exactly where it was. So what's my point? Through the 1920s, guided by X-ray and guided by the neurocoulometer, BJ Palmer, in the course of him doing his research, not just him, but a great number of other chiropractors all over the US and the world as well, they're recognizing more and more and more and more and more and more that's like, you know, there's really something special about C1 and C2. In other words, when we're starting adjusting people with either Atlas or Axis, most of these other wacky findings are actually going away on their own. We don't have to adjust people near as much. We don't have to adjust near as many subluxations. People are getting better results faster when we're focusing and addressing this area first. So much so that in basically the early 1930s, this is what BJ converts to. And keep in mind, he's been in practice for 30 years at this point. And he basically comes out to the profession in 1933 and proclaims, after all of my years and the development of all of this stuff, this is where it's at. Why? Because this is what the research, the best research that we can do in the day, this is what it is showing. It's showing Atlas and Axis, guys, this is where it is. We have to own this. We've got to get this right. We need to be specific. This is a really big deal. So much so, this book had actually been in work for a number of years. He publishes one of his Magnus Opera, the Subluxation Specific, Green Book, volume 18. It's about this thick. Don't be intimidated because at least half of it is just pictures of X-rays. So it's not that thick in terms of its context. It's a very dense book, but this is where he comes out basically saying, after 30 years, this is where I am focusing my time and attention, and this is where I am advocating that we need to go as a profession. It's about C1, C2. He wrote about it, in fact, in a great many of the green books that he published thereafter. In order, these are just some of them for your own perusal, if and when you've got the time, all that sort of stuff. Culminating in one of the last ones, which was History in the Making. Really, it's only about 100 pages, as you also see. It's not technically green, it's a little pamphlet of sorts. And the reason that this one is actually worthwhile stand out is because this is the book where BJ actually introduces the idea to the profession that, after doing another 30 years, basically, of only adjusting C1, C2, he says, you know what, I maybe made a mistake. You can have independent issues and misalignments occurring C3 and back below. In other words, the reintroduction of full spine technique. However, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, people misunderstood what he said, and they said, oh, BJ said we can adjust everything in the spine again. Okay, here we go. And let's start pushing everything like we were all the way back in the very beginning. In other words, they forgot about all the scientific developments that occurred before then in terms of how to be specific, which is very, very, very unfortunate in my opinion. So nevertheless, there's a good chunk of research there's a good amount of resources through BJ's research that's still available for all of us to read. What were some of the research that he was doing? Well, he was actually demonstrating full spine changes on X-ray just by adjusting C1 and C2. That is Green Book Volume 20, which is actually a very big yellow book. It's about this big. It's just picture after picture after picture after picture of full spine postural X-ray changes occurring after C1, C2 adjustments only. As we said, he also improved the neurocoulometer, the heat detecting instrument, made it far more reliable and far more precise to be able to detect these actual changes. And where and why is all of this important? Remember, we described a subluxation as containing 4, arguably 5 elements: misalignment, occlusion, pressure interference, and body's not ability to fix it on its own. So guess what X-ray is demonstrating? It's X-ray that's showing changes with mechanical alignment. You've got instrumentation that's showing changes in neurophysiology, heat distributions, and nerve function. You've got this fun little thing here, the electroencephaloneuromentympograph, aka the tympograph, which is a precursor to an EEG, but something that was done not just of the brain, but was actually done to measure electrical activity. We believe it was neuromuscular activity, so kind of like a surface EMG. In other words, measuring the function of flow basically along the spine. Again, using instrumentation as a way to determine, are we having positive neurophysiological effects as a result of adjusting the spine? There was also the development of the wet specimen. Fascinating story about this one here. Because remember, back in this area, you've got people who are saying there's no such thing as a subluxation. It's impossible. You guys are making it up. What you're seeing on your X-rays, it's just shadows of 3D anatomy and 2-dimensional projections. It's nonsense. BJ says, okay, fine. I need to find somebody who can verify if this is the case. So he and a buddy of his, Stanley Bolton, an Australian, they go over to the one research facility in the world in 1938 who is willing to do this type of experiment. Not experiment, the specimen. Well, what is the specimen? And this is its picture over here. It's called a wet specimen. What they did was they took a person at the moment of death. The second after, split second after death, they cryogenically freeze the person's head. They decapitate it. They then proceed with a series of Breaking Bad-like baths. If you guys have not seen Breaking Bad, and this is starting to show my age, which is kind of scary. It's not that old, and yet it is. They basically need a way of doing away with human bodies so they don't get caught by the cops by dumping the bodies in vats of acid, and they dissolve. So what do they do with this head specimen? They basically dip it in a series of solutions, strips away the skin, strips away the muscle, strips away the nerve, strips away everything with the exception of the periosteum, the connective tissue around the bone. So this is not the bone, this is the outline of the bone. And remember, 1938, there's no such thing as a CT, there's no such thing as an MRI. So what this is, and it still exists at the Palmer School, and you can go see it if you can ever get on a plane to go see it, that what you see is a specimen of the outline of a skull, an atlas, and an axis with the neural canal right here. And I've looked at this thing, and you see plain as day, there is articular disrelationship going on that specimen. And for BJ, this was it. This was like, for all of you guys who say this is not possible, we went through as many measures as we can to get as close to a living specimen as we possibly could. Here it is. As evidence, again, for this idea, this thing that subluxation actually exists. Now, a little bit morbid part of the story here. Where was this particular experiment done? Well, as we said, there was only one part in the world in the 1930s that would agree to do something like this. This was in Germany. Who was in charge of Germany in 1938? A fellow named Adolf Hitler. So what's the point in telling this story? I mean, you could say, how exactly did you get this specimen made in the first place? There's all kinds of conjecture about that. But ultimately, the point being here is that BJ Palmer and Dr. Bolton have the guts to go into Germany in 1938 to have this done so that we can have evidence to put forth to the profession, to the opponents of chiropractic, that this thing that we are talking about called subluxation is not some pie in the sky kind of thing, that it's not just an idea that we have constructed so that we can survive separate from medicine, that through the course of our research, it is a real thing that we are able to demonstrate its existence. This is the kind of thinking that led BJ with all of this research to conclude when you adjust C1 and C2, that is what is having the most profound difference in terms of human function, their potential to be well. That's where he dedicated his life, his focus for the entire second half of his career. I repeat, at the very end, he did recognize and state that you can have independent misalignments below C1 and C2, but, and if you don't believe me, go read this book. I am paraphrasing, but I'm not misrepresenting. He said, what you do is you do the equivalent of all of these tests the same the way that we've taught you. You make sure that Atlas and Atlas are clear. They are not subluxated and you are certain. And then you wait at least 2 weeks. And if you have persistent findings that still, despite all of that, they don't clear out, proceed based on the evidence that is presented to you. In no way did he ever say, well, let's start pushing here and start pushing there, and maybe we need to do this and maybe we need to do that. No, he was what was called upper cervical specific until the very end. And this is the difference in terminology that a lot of even upper cervical chiropractors don't realize to this day. You see, there was an era, and there still are certain upper cervical techniques that are C1, C2 only. These are what are called upper cervical exclusive techniques or hole-in-one, HIO techniques. But there are also what are called upper cervical specific techniques. These are those of us who say, you know what, C1, C2, massive deal. It's got to be cleared out. But if our tests show that there are those independent things going on below, we are analyzing and then adjusting those as precisely as we can using the exact same principles in care in the way as if we were treating C1, C2. So difference right there, little bits of interesting trivia for you there. So what we've done so far, we've basically spent the first 30 minutes here just sort of walking you through the developments through BJ Palmer's career. This is a chart that is adapted from Dr. Simon Sensen in terms of the different philosophies, philosophical teachings, their students, and all of that sort of stuff within chiropractic. What I have done is I have highlighted on this particular chart and added a few more the fellows who actually have gone on to develop chiropractic techniques. In other words, all the colors that you see here represent different chiropractic techniques. Here in 2022, there are still at least 40 different mainstream techniques, all under this one umbrella called chiropractic. So what do I want to show you this? These ones that still are highlighted were students of BJ's, or students of BJ's. In other words, there's a direct lineage that you could trace right back to this guy right here and all of the research that he did on the upper cervical. Some of these are full spine techniques. Others are the upper cervical specific techniques. So point is that if you trace and understand the shared lineologies here, then you can appreciate, oh, okay, these are how these ones are both similar, but then these are how these ones are different. This is why we may agree on certain philosophical tenets, but then our technique looks so different. But this is where, you know, our technique looks so similar, but then why we can't agree on anything else in terms of what's going on in the body right there. So where we're going to be focusing our attention for the rest of tonight's little chat, story time, are the development of the mainstream upper cervical techniques that we still have here in 2022. There are 6, arguably 7, and we're going to go through each of these ones right here in brief. So we're going to start with the perpetuation of the original hole-in-one knee-chest approach. So the knee-chest table, and again, we have a complete, we'll be doing, I think it's in June, maybe July. No, it's June. A completely different talk just like this one here, where we're going to be looking about, why do we use tables in the way that we do? Just a little bit of that background history here. But ever so briefly, the original chiropractic benches were basically wooden slabs. Then they were wooden slabs in 2 sections, one for the upper part of your body and then one for the lower part of your body. And there was a big hole in the middle so that you could create a lot of cleavage force when you would be producing the adjustment. Then there was the introduction in the, I believe it was the teens or the 1920s, of what was called the new posture, AKA the knee chest posture. This is a table where it's got a headpiece and the patient is essentially down on their knees with their head turned on this headpiece, which is what this picture right here is actually representing. A person lined up in a knee chest position here. And this was actually used for adjusting the entire spine. But as BJ then develops the upper cervical work, then it was used in this original position right through here. Now, this gentleman right here, and actually this will be fun. There might only be the 2 of you, and maybe even only the 1 of you on this particular chat who will recognize who these faces actually are, because they're known in the upper cervical world, but they're not known in general chiropractic. So if you recognize the faces of the people who are on my slides before I name them, put them in the chat box, because I'm just curious to see who knows who. Now, this guy doesn't count. If you recognize BJ, good on you, but that guy doesn't count. So let's start with this guy right here. This guy is Lyle Sherman. So Lyle Sherman was BJ Palmer's second in command of the research clinic. Interestingly, graduated in 1934, the same year as the unveiling of the upper cervical work. And so over the course of the research in the BJ Palmer Research Clinic, they go from using the knee chest to using a side lying adjustment to using a side lying with a Thompson headpiece mechanism. And as BJ then goes into retirement and shortly passes away, Dr. Sherman leaves the Palmer School and then just sets up an independent practice, moving out to, I believe it was South Carolina. I think it was Spartanburg. I could be mistaken, but I believe that's where he had gone. And it was his experience and his opinion that even though you had the introduction of the side posture positions, he still preferred doing the adjustment in the knee chest posture. And so that is exactly what he continued to do. So Lyle Sherman is the fellow who continued with the original HIO knee chest adjustment. Along comes his student, Michael Kale, who is this guy right here. So good on you for identifying him, Dr. Mark. Michael Kale is a graduate in 1964 from the Palmer School. So he graduates 3 years after BJ has already passed away. He graduates after they are already starting to reintroduce some full spine work into the Palmer School. Because for all those years, from the 30s to the late 50s, they were teaching HIO only, C1, C2, that's it. So he comes out of school and he learns that Dr. Sherman is actually practicing on his own. He's thinking, you know, this guy would have probably learned and would have really known a lot of stuff. So I want to go learn from him. So he goes out, he asks Dr. Sherman, can I learn everything from you? And Dr. Sherman says emphatically, no, kid, no, I don't have time for that. And yet Kale is very persistent, and he eventually does convince him to teach the knee chest work, because they're not teaching it the same way in the school. This is a whole other topic that gets into the evolution really of the Blair work. But we will say for right now, they were not teaching things the same way that BJ adjusted. Kale recognized this. And so he started learning direct under Lyle Sherman until ultimately his passing. And so it is sometimes and is now known as the Kale technique, the Kale brainstem method, and all this sort of stuff. But what the Kale technique, quote unquote, actually is it is the continuation of the knee chest that was given to him or taught to him by Lyle Sherman, which was the way that it was done back in the 1930s at the BJ Palmer Research Clinic. This picture right here. Now, from Kale, he had a great many students, and he was a force to be reckoned with in the teaching of chiropractic, philosophy, science, and art for the better part of, it probably would have been about 30 years. I think he passed away in the early 2000s, somewhere in there. But from here, he had a number of different students. One of them is going to be a fellow named Rob Kessinger, who would go on to develop what's called the knee chest upper cervical specific. This is one of the different knee chest groups that still exist to this day. Same adjustment, but what they do is they actually take Blair x-rays in order to determine the listing versus the standard A to P open mouths and lateral views that were used traditionally in the knee chest Kale kind of work. You also have more recently the introduction of what is known as the art of the specific, or TATS. This was developed jointly by this fellow right here named Andy Roberts. He passed away, I think it was 5 years ago now. And his business partner, Sean Dill, who is still quite very active in chiropractic and also in business development circles. Same thing, basically similar style of adjustment, but different kind of x-ray. What these guys are doing is they're taking the x-rays by introducing motion, that is lateral flexion, in order to see, is the segment actually mechanically moving the way that it should be? In other words, not just a static view, but do you see the normal mechanics as you would normally suspect? There are additional knee chest techniques out there. There is the Upper Cervical Society, which is led by Ray Drury, I believe. There are a couple of additional organizations out in California. Their names elude me, so please do forgive me. This is not meant as an oversight or as putting anybody aside. But my point is that from the original lineage that you can trace back through Lyle Sherman, ultimately to BJ Palmer, you have this entire spectrum of knee chest upper cervical techniques. You also have the continuation of the HIO toggle recoil. And this is the very basic toggle recoil that you, at least if you go to school at certain places over in the US, you have an entire unit on this class. If you had it in Australia, you maybe had 2 hours on it. And most of that was just probably talking about things. My point is that rather than doing it in a knee chest position, they are doing a quicker toggle recoil mechanism where they've introduced a Palmer-Thompson drop headpiece. The idea is that the drop piece produces a vibration and also gives the doctor more room to be able to get in and out without disturbing the other ways. You see, with the knee chest adjustment, there is usually a notable cavitation. It's not painful, but there is still a cavitation. With the rest of the upper cervical techniques, there isn't, full stop. And it started with the development of the toggle recoil. You also then have the Blair technique. What's the Blair technique? Well, the Blair technique is the evolution of, toggle recoil. We've talked about, at least in the last couple of presentations, and if you weren't here, that's okay. The short of it is the recognition that the spine is not symmetrical in any way. Not on the outside, not on the inside, and not on the left side, not on the right side. We need to be able to take these individual differences into account in order to determine what the most accurate vector for correction is. And when you do that, you end up actually applying your art ever so slightly differently with each patient. And it turns out that that was actually what this guy was able to do. You see, BJ had the uncanny ability to look on an X-ray, and he was actually taking some very interesting views that, again, a lot of people don't even know about, where you could see three-dimensionally what was actually going on in a person's architecture. As a result, even though he would have been doing a toggle recoil adjustment, he didn't do it with a quick little tap. He did it with a bit of a body windup, to the point where, as this guy, William Blair, is developing and researching his work through the 1940s, not the 1940s, he graduated in 49, through the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 70s, he's not really doing a straight toggle anymore. He's introducing this torque movement that you do with your arm like this. And interestingly, it was when he was teaching his work at the school that would bear this guy's name some many years later, when Dr. Sherman was still alive. He was actually watching Dr. Blair adjust, and he basically, paused the class and said, you guys need to pay attention, because what this guy is doing is he is adjusting the way that BJ used to adjust. So what is Blair? Blair is a reverse engineered, and it was not done on purpose this way, but essentially what is it? It's a reverse engineered BJ Palmer sideline toggle recoil torque adjustment. So these are what are known as the upper cervical articular techniques in a nutshell, because essentially their focus is in terms of what's actually happening with the way that the individual joints are lining up. Contrast this with the upper cervical orthogonal techniques. Now, again, we're putting you out there. Can you guys name these names on this page if you so happen to know who they are? I'd be curious if you can. I know that there's going to be at least one of you who can. I do know that. So what's the idea here? The idea here is that you can have these individual differences, but what we can do, Mark knows it, is that we can essentially look and bisect the skull and the neck and do alignments like this. And what we're looking at is we're looking to see how can we determine through mechanical engineering principles, where is it that the atlas, the axis, should be lining up relative to the opening of where a person's foramen magnum would be. In other words, calculating a vector so that you know this is where you need to actually do your adjustment. That's kind of it in a nutshell. It all starts with this guy right here. This guy's name, good, Jared got it, A. Wernsing. So Alec Wernsing, he was a Palmer graduate in 1926. He goes out to California and he's interested in, again, in this idea that BJ is proposing called the HIO principle. And what Alec Wernsing is finding is he's finding that it's Atlas is the big deal. In fact, he starts to write about this and uses the expression that he would publish so many years later, that Atlas, and I quote, moves around the occipital condyles as if around the rims of a circle. In other words, this is how Atlas is moving. It's not moving straight left, not moving straight right. It does this kind of an action right here. And in fact, he actually shared a good chunk of his early research with B.J. Palmer. And it's told that BJ, who was still in the process of writing his book, The Adjustment Specific, its original title was actually The Axis Specific. In other words, BJ thought axis is where it's at. But arguably, it was because of Wernsing's work that BJ said, this guy's got a point. I've got to incorporate what he's doing into my work. And so BJ's work then included Axis and Atlas. Wernsing is also the developer of what was called the early cephalometric. It was a template that you could use, and he developed what was called a Nasium projection, which is where you're not looking through the open mouth, you're looking more at a caudal angle to look right through the Atlas plane line so that you can see it in its true profile to know which way it's actually going without the projectional distortion that you would get on an A to P open mouth. One of his greatest successes and most influenced students was this guy, John Francis Grostic. This guy was an engineer out in Detroit, basically dying of leukemia. Goes to see a chiropractor who's doing one of the upper cervical techniques, gets better, lives, and goes to chiropractic school to learn how to do that. And over that period of time, he starts to realize a few things because, again, this guy's got an engineering brain. He looks at the work that BJ is doing and saying, okay, yep, ASRP, PLI, stuff like that. But, really, there are different degrees of variation that we need to take into proper consideration when we're doing this analysis. And you know what? I think that this guy Wernsing, he's onto something here. So what Grostic goes on to develop is what was basically bore his name for decades, the Grostic procedure. It is a modified toggle, so not a full-blown toggle, but it's more of a maneuver that looks something a bit like this. Can be done by hand or with an instrument using a different kind of mechanical engineering analysis to determine how is it that Atlas is actually misaligned as if around the rim of a circle. He would be a graduate in 1930, I want to say 37. No, that's not right. It was a bit earlier than that. Do forgive me, it eludes me. But he starts doing some of his research. I think he starts doing his research in 1937. And 2 years later, he is joined by this guy over here. This guy's name is Ralph Gregory. And so these guys, both of them from Detroit, go back and forth and they start developing what was actually then become known as the Grostic procedure. Grostic would have ideas, Gregory would have ideas, and they worked together as a beautiful team developing this technique over many, 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 many years. They unfortunately have a falling out because this fellow feels that this guy is not taking all of his ideas into proper consideration, to the point where Gregory separates from the Grostic organization and founds his own technique, something that is called the National Upper Cervical Chiropractic Association, aka NUCCA, right here. The idea is that we are not pushing the bone per se, but through a slightly different method of analysis, we are producing a triceps pull. If you think about basic physics, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So you are not pushing the bone down like this, but if you create tension up through the doctor's triceps, what that's actually going to do is that will produce a downwards force. You don't need to shove the bone into place in order to make the correction. In other words, they're finding over the course of all of these techniques that you can go lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter, and things keep responding better and better and better and better. They never Grostic and Gregory never fully reconcile. And it was because this guy passed away very, very suddenly in 1974. That story is that I believe it was the FDA was doing a bit of a witch hunt against anybody who owned what was called a microdynamometer or something like that. What it was a device not similar from a Rife machine. It was meant to, or supposedly, measure electrical conduits in a person's body, and different practitioners of alternative medicine, all of that sort of stuff, could use one of these things to diagnose different kinds of conditions and all of this sort of stuff. Now, the thing about it is the FDA said that this is nothing but pure quackery. And so, A, you can't just use one of these, but B, if you own one of these, we are coming to get you. And so what they did on Halloween in 1974, they raided John's Grostic's office. And he apparently, we don't even know if he actually owned one, to tell you the truth. But he was so shaken, he died a couple days later. It basically, the stress of the experience killed him, is what happened. And so after John Grostic's death, and Gregory has already left the organization, the remaining instructors get together and they start to develop, okay, how do we continue with, this guy's work and legacy? In then comes this guy. So this guy is Roy Sweat, who only just passed away, I believe it was 2 months ago now. So he is one of the Grostic instructors. He graduated in the early 50s, no, excuse me, late 40s, early 50s, and he became a Grostic instructor in the 50s. So he and Gregory were, very big contemporaries. Gregory was most fascinated in terms of continuing the hand adjustment, a la the Grostic technique. Dr. Sweat was interested in pursuing the instrumentation side of it. Now, irrespective, Dr. Sweat, he continues and is actually the one who was the first president when they rebranded the Grostic technique as the Orthosphinology Society in 1977. But then what he does a few years later is he actually separates, because his own ideas are starting to become standalone, that in 1981, he founds what is known as Atlas orthogonality, which is the instrument that you see right here. This device is not actually a percussive instrument at all. It uses a solenoid, which is like a ping, transmits a vibration through a mechanical rod, and it's the vibration that allows the Atlas to actually release. Again, lighter, being more effective, at least in terms of what the research is showing over a period of time. Now, both of these organizations, and so this is the lineage. So again, you go back to HIO, and then the orthogonal techniques. You've got the Grostic work, which gave rise to sibling techniques, Atlas orthogonal on the instrumentation side, NUCA on the by hand side. Each of these has given rise to its own variations. On the NUCA side, it's given rise to the quantum spinal mechanics 3 technique, which is using the same adjusting style as NUCA, but it's a lot more free form. It's not near as analytical, and it actually considers not just C1, but all the way down to C7. So it's more of a full cervical technique. Atlas orthogonal, excuse me, has since had a couple branches off, one of them being advanced orthogonal, led by Stan Pierce Sr. And then his son has also developed his own work, EPIC, the evolutionary percussive instrument correction. Since then, the short of it, very, very similar, but slightly different methodologies in terms of analysis, procedures, protocols, and all of this sort of stuff. But this then introduces you guys to a little bit of all of the different upper cervical techniques that we still have in existence even today. So let's just show you guys ever so quickly, some of the videos that we do have about this. Now, I do have a question that was asked to me privately. Excuse me. This is what happens when you talk really fast for a long period of time. Throat starts going off. How does the integrator tool work in any of these, if at all, in TRT? This is actually a different technique. It's called MC squared. It uses the TRT instrument and TRT principles to derive a vector, and then uses the instrument in order to perform the correction. let me point this out to you. The fact that we have all of these different techniques, do you think that anybody has got it all figured out just yet? No, the answer is no. We've got organizations that, as you can see, they use traditional knee chest style. Then you've got knee chest that uses Blair analysis. Then you have upper cervical techniques, but now incorporate lower cervical mechanics. In fact, Pettibone and then CBP are actually derivations from the Grostic technique that reincorporated the principles back from not just the upper neck, but into the full spine. So again, we go back to this chart here, you will see, where is it? Okay, so we got Wernzing, Grostic, there you go, Pettibone, Harrison. So that's the procedure right there. Hoffman, this is the developer of the TRT instrument. Now he was influenced very much by Jay Holder, who in turn would have gotten a lot of his work from Donnie Epstein and also from Arlen Fuhrer. So that linear progression. And of course, you start to have a lot more crisscross of all of these things going back and forth as you do. So blah, 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 blah. Can a TRT instrument still use and work with any of these? The short answer is yes. The point is that these different adjustments seem to work by different mechanical principles. And why is it that we have all of these different methods? A, because nobody has it all figured out. But then B, we are all attracted to the different methods that resonate the most with us. Some love doing it by instrumentation only. I used to do that until my table almost died. And I got really scared and realized I need to be able to adjust by hand again. And so I was thinking, okay, I need to go learn me the NUCA work, until I was introduced to the Blair X-rays and go, oh my God, I need to learn that. And so here we are. But in the same breath, I had actually made an effort so that at least it's either taking courses, reading their textbooks, learning from as many different authors as I can. I have actually made an effort to learn principles and pieces from all of these different techniques to know how they are similar, how they differ, but also how they integrate together. And wouldn't it be nice if we could actually take something and say, okay, we're going to put the best of the best of the best in there. So can you use a TRT instrument? Of course you can. Will it work exactly the same? Maybe not. It's all about the outcome. So what do we got just as we're wrapping up the hour here? So this is the original BJ Palmer knee chest style of adjustment in 1934. This video is often used to terrify people thinking, oh my God, look at how hard he's going to punch that guy in the neck. However, you also have individuals then who say that they were adjusted by BJ and it felt like no more than if he was basically, and I quote, tapping on a typewriter. In other words, very quick, very specific, and it wasn't painful. As part of this video that I don't have, what you will sometimes see is you'll see people with their feet lift off the back of the table and people say, oh my God, that's how hard he hit them. Well, guess what? I've got some people who are lying in a side posture position, and guess what? I see their body make a little bit of a jiggle like that, even after I've put just the lightest little force into them. What it's called is it's called an innate recoil. It has nothing to do with the force of the adjustment. It's the body's response that engages and kicks in after doing the force. If any of you guys have ever studied network, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So knee chest adjustment. Then we've got BJ giving the side posture adjustment. And you'll notice it's not just necessarily a quick little tap, but there's a bit of a wind up. In other words, he is generating torque. He is producing torque when producing this particular adjustment. Again, this is a very important concept, especially when we are teaching you guys the Blair work. Then you've got the orthospinology instrument correction. And so what you'll see that this device does is it actually produces, not too dissimilar from a TRT instrument, slight downward incursion and bit of torque.
You ready? Here we go.
So
just a couple of times.
A little tap.
Okay with that?
Yeah.
Don't move. Got one more place to go.
So the thing with the instrument in orthospinology is they are not an upper cervical exclusive. Well, they actually are, but they aren't atlas only. So in this particular example, he's adjusting atlas, and then he's also immediately adjusting axis.
You're going to feel a little pressure here. Try to relax fully. Got 3 of those. 2 and 1 more.
So she is either an amazing
That's
actress
all there was to
and
it.
she's
Now
in
that's the-
agony, or the point is it's not really painful at all. And that's the point. Some of this stuff can look a lot more intimidating than it is. Precise and gentle. These are the key. The lighter and the more precise, the better. Now, this one's going to look very, very similar, but this is the Atlas orthogonal instrument. So you will see that there is no downward dispersion here at all. What's going to happen is there's a mechanical rod here that's going to hit a spring, and it just gives a tap.
Render the adjustment, but since Dr. Dave's not out of adjustment, we're not going to do that. We're
So
gonna
it
have
just
him
makes a
sit
little
up
vibration of
and
that plate right there, what
press.
he's going to show.
So when it's time to actually render the adjustment, I'm going to hit this pedal, and as you can see here, all that happens is that hammer hits.
So you don't see it, but the hammer hits the spring, but that metal rod there does not move. So it's more like, okay, if I was to just do this on the finger, you could feel the vibration occur through the other end. Super duper light. That's it. What else do we got? We got a Nuka adjustment. This is essentially the same thing, but by
The
hand.
X-rays, the table goes very low to the ground. I position myself in relation to the person's first vertebra, which is I
Mhm.
contact right behind the ear.
This is Dr.
and I
Jamie
contact
Stern. She's out
very
in
gently, and I am
Sunnybank.
Putting in a force, it's just, you just can't feel it. Once I've done the correction, I've measured the patient, we've balanced the scales, we've unwound that top.
So I think that you can see that it looks like she's even barely touching her. And I will tell you, because I have been adjusted by Dr. Stern, you know that she's doing something, but you swear to God that she is not touching you. That is how, again, how light this stuff actually is. Then you've got Dr. Russell Freeman. I've also been adjusted by him. It's the same style of adjustment, but what you're going to see is it looks a lot more free form. In other words, he's not
IS,
lining up for an exact
IS,
vector. He's trying to
IS.
produce multiple lines of drive. As he
It's
said,
like a band,
feeling for resistance
relax.
and then
I'm
working
gonna go
through
to
it, if
T,
you would, like trying to iron out your shirt.
Tissue pull until it relaxes, relaxed. You can feel resistance with the side of your hand. I'm gonna use some torque. Okay, this is not clearing, so I'm gonna go.
So what he does, he's basically saying, if it's not clearing, I need to change my vector. And how is he gauging it? Because he can feel it with your hand. Again, I've studied this, and so I understand. I can feel when something is actually releasing. I repeat, it's not a cavitation. Then you've got a knee chest adjustment. This is Dr. Rob Kessinger. Again, about as good in the world as you possibly get. This video is very, very quick, but again, just to illustrate. In and out. Now, does this look like an unhappy lady to you? Again, knee chest can get a reputation for, oh my God, it's being so aggressive and their head is rotated and that's potentially dangerous and all that sort of stuff. The force vector of this adjustment is not into rotation. And so this is way safer than any of the cervical manipulation, rotatory things and all of that sort of stuff that's out there. Then we've got a toggle recoil adjustment. This is Dr. Daniel Kuhn. He passed away, I think it was about 7 years ago now. This is adjusting a young Drew Hall's son. Bear in mind that he was in his late 70s when doing this adjustment. So this is with the toggle drop headpiece. So just a very quick light tap. Dr. Kuhn, I had the chance to meet him. He had this is stories told to me, is that he would adjust his patients and then he would just lean over to them and he'd say, it's like, okay, next time, do better. In other words, it's like, make sure you don't stay out, make sure you don't go out of adjustment again. And then lastly, we have Dr. Fred Harkins here demonstrating a Blair adjustment. So in contrast with what Dr. Kuhn did was just a quick light tap, you'll see Dr. Harkins here is actually going to be doing that movement similar to what you saw with BJ with the elbow out coming in like that. That video kind of cut there a little bit, but it's worth watching again because he's quick. So it's that quick light toggle recoil. The sound is the table. The idea is that you are on and off before the patient even recognizes that you were there. Bit of analysis that was done in terms of, well, how much force is actually used with each of these. The traditional toggle recoil, by far the most, especially if it's knee chest, But as you see with Blair adjusting, with the modified toggle done as Grostic using a solenoid such as the Atlas orthogonal instrument, the Sid Williams research instrument, it was a cross between a sweat instrument and a Grostic instrument. You'll see that all of these things super duper light is a general rule, 5 kilos worth of force, which is the equivalent, if we were talking about it in terms of, well, what would that actually be the equivalent of? Whatever amount of force that you would need to click a pen. That is how much force actually goes in when these adjustments are delivered correctly. In terms of their analytical procedures, all of them use X-ray with the exception of QSM3. What they do is they use posture in order to determine what to adjust. So really that's where they're a little bit of the black sheep in the group. All of the articular techniques, we continue to use infrared thermography using a Titron instrument for pattern analysis. In reality, any of these techniques can crisscross and all of that sort of stuff to use any of these indicators. And a lot of upper cervical docs will adapt and borrow a bit from all of the different techniques. I'm just talking about what they officially do. All of the orthogonal techniques, with the exception of QSM3, they use a leg length inequality analysis. So does the Blair technique. The difference is that the Grostic-based techniques, they do it supine, Blair does it prone. The traditional knee, chest, and toggle, they don't use it at all because BJ didn't do it at all. QSM3 and NUCA, they will use either what's called an anatometer or a posture IQ. It's a device that you stand on with bilateral scales to see weight distribution, and you look to see how a person is actually standing, because the postural distortion, they argue, is an indication then of where and how there is stress in and through a person's body. And lastly, none of us will use palpation officially to determine what to adjust, with the exception of Atlas orthogonal, but they use palpation differently. They use what is called, oh, why am I drawing a blank on that? Joe's going to kill me, and I should know that. Basically a static palpation where you are, digital palpation, excuse me. You're not palpating the joint or the bone or any of that sort of stuff. But what you are doing is you are feeling the quadrants above and below the atlas on either side to determine, are there amounts of stress, swelling, and pressure? And if there is a persistent pattern, much like those of you who had gone over to and graduated from New Zealand, you use your muscle palpation and you use your other patterning principles in order to determine what and how this works. Scanning palpation. Thank you, Joe. That is basically how it is used. It's used as an indication, not what to adjust, not how to adjust, but when to adjust. Now, we also have a question there. Wait a minute. Was it not Dr. Grostic who theorized the dentate ligament spinal cord distortion hypothesis? Yes, it was. That's why it bears his name. So Dr. Grostic did theorize the dentate ligament spinal cord distortion hypothesis. If you don't know what that is, come back in 2 months, because we will be going through a grand neurology overview. So again, I've been telling you stories to share with you about all the different techniques that exist. But if you want to know a little bit more of the background research that really makes this stuff solid, we're going to cover that for you in a couple of months. So come back on that. But why no Tritron on Grostic-derived techniques? Because he didn't use one. I'd like to give you more than that. He didn't use one. Or if he did use the NCM, he found that the supine leg check was a more reliable indicator for him in order to determine that it was the appropriate adjustment that needed to be done. So you want to learn more about this sort of stuff? Well, go find this book. Good luck with that, because it's out of print. You can still find them. They're going to be a little bit more expensive than they used to be. Unless you're Jared, then you find one like super cheap, but that's Jared. Lucky Jared. I'm envy of that guy. I'm giving him sass, but he knows why. But what you actually have is, at least in years past, you had it where all of us were very insular in our different technique groups: Atlas orthogonal, Blair, Epic, Knee Chest Society, KCUCS, NUCA, Orthosphinology, QSM3, and TATS. We all were very insular and very protective of our work and all this sort of stuff. But the ICA out of the US is basically developed the Council on Upper Cervical Care, and they've also developed the Diplomat on Craniocervical Junction Procedures. And it's a way then of us getting to get together and say, you know what? Yeah, we do disagree on certain things, but you know what? A rising tide raises all ships. And we do agree on the vast majority of the principles in which we are trying to do, again, in being as personalized, independent, precise as we possibly can be for addressing these problems that we see at the craniocervical junction, that is atlas and axis, and how this has full spine implication in terms of not just mechanics, but also neurology, function, and expression of overall life. So we get together, well, not me, because I'm actually not a member of this, although if I was in the States, I sure would be. But the short is they get all the different people from all the groups together so that we can ultimately learn from each other, so that all of us moving forward are able to be much stronger. We are, far greater force when we are united than we are divided. Now, my apologies, so I have gone 10 minutes over, and I didn't even get to all the stories that I wanted to share, but that's okay. And I'm not going to take up too more of your time here this evening, but just letting you guys know, what do we got in store for you here? Still working on seminars for Melbourne. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get that one to go. We're going to need more heads for that. We're looking tentatively at August the 2nd and the 3rd. We get enough people there, we're going to be there, is the short of it, unless Dan has something to say about that. I am also in the background working on Auckland or somewhere in New Zealand. The soonest we'd be looking at somewhere in and around July. That will all depend on what she decides to do and all that sort of stuff. So we're working on that. As far as the rest of us, Brisbane, level 1, it's coming up here pretty quick, 22nd of May. We are both doing this one live and in person, which is what I recommend if you can. However, if you are abroad or for whatever reason you cannot make it, we are doing that virtually, where we will be streaming it. And it's not the same, but we can still give you all of the background theory, all of the knowledge, the skills, and show you how you are able then to use and implement this kind of work on your own so that you can be much stronger forward going. So we are working on that. That's what we have coming up. I will actually previously on this link or on this chat here, I put the link for where you guys can sign up for this stuff. So that's the paid stuff. As far as the no charge to you guys stuff, next round, next month, what we've got here is module 4, tech drills. In other words, we're going to show you guys this is what and how you actually set your body up to turn you into the adjusting machine, to be able to do the upper cervical toggle recoil work, to be able to do the Blair work. Sorry, Joe, if you do the AO work, you need to be able to draw lines and be able to click a button, which works really, really good. But for anybody who's doing the adjust manually, there's certain skills that you got to develop. And even then, believe it or not, there's still a lot of skills and tactile sensations you still need to be able to know AO. And I know that again because I used to do that. Yep, I'm very familiar with the situations over there as far as what's going on, Jared. Nevertheless, want to be able to do and offer whatever I can to do. So we will see what we can do. So anyway, that's what we've got coming up for you guys one way or another. So does anybody have any answers or any thoughts from tonight's little presentation? Because I could sure use some answers. We'll give everybody a moment here. I'm just looking at Mark's comment for Joe regards the Australian chapter of the ICA Council on the Upper Cervical Care. So the ICA, despite its namesake, is a US-based organization. Yes, they have a member who is quote unquote an Australian representative. However, they're about as useful as the UN. That's not a knock against the ICA, mind you, but what I mean by that is that the ICA has no political might here in Australia, which is quite unfortunate. If we were going to have an independent chapter, it would most likely have to be a special division. One of the things that they're doing with the ICA, or excuse me, with the ACA here in Australia. But then in order for that to proceed, you would actually have to have a significant, demand, proportion, interest, and all of that sort of stuff. And you guys can see how many people here are on the chat tonight. Like I had said in the beginning, I'm very much of the persuasion that in the upper cervical world, we've got some of the most powerful stuff that is out there in chiropractic. And yet look in Australia, how many of us are either A, already doing it, or B, how many people are even on this call? And this call, was free. It was an hour of your time, and hopefully well worth your time. It seems that it is a very rare chiropractor who's got the analytical nature, the questioning nature. They want to know the who, what, where, when, how, and they're willing to work through challenges in order to be able to give that something special, that extra something, for their patients. And so I've been of the persuasion very much for a long period of time, as much as and as desirable as it would be, this will not attract the vast majority of the field practitioners out there. This is only for a very select few. So I do appreciate, and I thank you guys for, being on there on this call and all of this sort of stuff here. And I do also, hope here too, that, this is also going to be a spark where you're going to say, it's like, okay, that was, some pretty interesting stuff there. So yeah, I am definitely going to want to learn me some more of that and all that sort of stuff. And my point is, I'm happy to provide the resources and all of that sort of stuff that I can. I'm one person, Joe's one person, Mark, you're one person, Jared, you're one person. All of the rest of you guys, we're each one person. We nevertheless, we do the best that we can. Each one is with the resources we have too. Okay. So what do we got? I saw a couple of comments there and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, we should get together and all of that sort of stuff. And then really, I'd say mix findings, but how can you mix when you're adjusting C1 only? Although side joke about that, but nobody will get that. Okay, so, sorry, we missed somebody. It looks like they rocked up at just the wrong time there. So apologies for that one. I don't do this as money-making endeavors and all that sort of stuff, but feel free for the person who joined late, get in contact with me. I do make the recordings available. It's like $10, basically just for, the basic stuff like that. So it's not an arm and a leg and all that sort of stuff. If any of you guys want the recordings and all of that sort of stuff, if you didn't quite catch it, or if you wanted to go back and, cross-check and say, actually, Jeff, according to so-and-so, you weren't actually 100% accurate there. That's all okay. Anyway, I don't think that we actually had any particular questions or anything like that. So on that note, then I will leave you guys with, there we go, my contact details, all that sort of stuff. If you do need to reach out to me at any point, take the screenshot, take a camera, something like that, take the picture there. We'll give you the moment. Otherwise, well, thank you guys for rocking out here for the evening. And we hope to see you either before next month, if on the odd chance and all that sort of stuff. Otherwise, we will see you next month, April the 6th, where we're going to be moving the bodies a little bit more, getting a little bit nutty and crazy. Okay, so Jared's going to get out there, hand clap. Joe's going to get out there, drink some green beer. Good on him. Thank you, guys. We will see you then next time. Bye now.